Welcome to the third presentation where we're looking at the letter that James wrote. He wrote this letter to little groups of followers. These people had come from a Jewish background and they were being put under pressure, almost certainly economic pressure, and were having problems to know how to cope and how to move forward. And of course, if you're under economic pressure, you can get a distorted view of wealth. And in the days of Jesus and shortly after, if you had wealth and possessions, it was a sign of God's favour in much thought of the day. That can still occur today. I mean, you can end up blaming the have-nots for having not. It's a wrong understanding, but it was common, and James gives guidance as to how to handle it. The problem with wealth is this: wealth is not wrong, but it can give power and a sense of superiority. It can give us a sense of self-sufficiency. We can cope, we can do it, we have no problems, and therefore we don't see any need in ourselves. And very often that cuts us off from responding to Jesus. We think we can, we don't need any help. But equally there's a danger, and it happened in the days of James, a danger to use wealth and possessions for power, and to suppress and even oppress those who did not have, and to use it to manipulate other people. And Jesus had much to say about that situation in his day. And what basically James is stressing is that we're all made in God's image, and in God's eyes we are all of equal value. Therefore, as followers of Jesus, we've got to treat everyone in the light of that. And that relates not just to wealth, to possessions, but also to education, position in society, and every other aspect of life. We are all of equal value in God's eyes. James also looks at this difficult word, faith. The problem is that the word has changed its meaning in language. And so often faith today is presented as just believing that certain things are true. They may be true or they may not be true, but you believe that they are true. And in a sense that gets us nowhere. And that's not what the original word means. And James is stressing that's not what faith is all about. Faith is that. It's a word in the original languages of action. It's a word of response. Response to what God has done for us in Jesus is how we would see faith in the Christian sense. The problem with that is that's just a mental activity. And it may or may not affect the way we live. But when we respond to what Jesus has done, we are committing ourselves to act in response to God's initiative. That means that what we do has to change. And James is stressing that faith is a word of activity, not a word of intellectual acceptance. Many have put up that there is a disagreement between Paul and James. This is entirely in the world of make-believe. That's what Paul was saying. You see it most clearly in his letter to the Galatians, but he works it out more fully in the later letter to the Romans. We're not able to impress God by adherence to some kind of rule system. That's what religion keeps trying to make us do. Do this, do that, do the other, God will be pleased. Laughable that any of us could be good enough to impress God by our activities. James is hammering the idea to see faith as kind of an intellectual acceptance. You believe this, you accept this is true, a kind of mental agreement. That's not what the word means. And if you think about it, that kind of faith has no value whatsoever. Paul is stressing that the key to acceptance before God is responding to what God has done for us in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Not self-effort. James is stressing that that kind of faith, that kind of response, is a word of decision, which leads to action. We act accordingly. It's not just intellectual. They were both addressing different audiences in different circumstances, but their picture is totally consistent, and they both draw on Abraham as one of the best exemplars of real faith. Abraham responded to God, and then the Bible describes he then went and did something. It worked out in life, it worked out in action. Now, with that in mind, let's move forward into the next section. Chapter 3, right through to verse 12 of chapter 4, we enter the world of teaching. And we can broaden it out to the kind of control of what we say, which influences other people. The problem is that we have a mental picture of teaching which is kind of 21st century, although many of us, our picture of teaching is out of date. And we've got a picture of that. Someone at the front talking at an audience, and a kind of transfer of the contents of the mind of the speaker into the minds of the listeners. That's the kind of mental picture we've got. We picture someone at the front, perhaps nowadays, using the computer to help, or a screen or a blackboard or something, and a passive audience just sitting or receiving. Now, first of all, that is so far from the truth of what goes on in real schools today. It's unbelievable. It's a kind of 19th, early 20th century picture. Schools today are not like that. They're hums of activity, hives of activity, people involved in their learning, in working things through for themselves under the direction of a teacher. And it's not someone at the front just pouring knowledge over them. But it's even worse when we come to churches. Someone in a pulpit or on a platform, behind a lectern, perhaps holding on grimly to a Bible, shouting at us. And the only token gesture to new technology is they may have a microphone in their left hand. That's nothing to do with the world of teaching in the secular world. We're utterly out of date. But it's nothing to do with the world of teaching in the first century, the Christian era. So we've got to get rid of this. Teaching is a central idea in the Bible. In the New Testament alone, the word group for teaching is used over 200 times. And it may surprise you that in the original language there is no word for preaching in the sense that we use it today. You may protest and say you find it in your New Testament, but it's not translating that at all. It's translating evangelism or heralding the gospel, which is nothing to do with standing on a platform shouting at people. In the culture of the first century, most could not read or write. Therefore, teachers had great importance and power. There were no schools and universities in any recognizable form that we recognize today. Teaching was sharing in small groups. And it involved dialogue. They didn't have platforms, they didn't have pulpits, they certainly didn't have microphones. It was a totally different concept of what teaching is all about. And in fact, in schools and universities today, That's a closer picture of what teaching is all about. Teaching and learning is allowing learners to explore ideas under direction, not pouring information into them or shouting at them. Schools and universities have changed dramatically over the centuries. Too often the church has got stuck in a 19th century thought form. What would happen would be this: a small group would gather round a teacher. The teacher would always sit, and that explains why Jesus sat while he was teaching people. That was the pattern of the day. It would be a sharing of ideas. Often there would be discussion and debate. If the group was small enough, as it usually was, because there was no microphones, people could ask questions. And people weren't qualified as teachers. We need that today to control the profession. But not then. Someone who's recognized as experienced and could take the group a bit further forward. Now, the Christian groups which were scattered all throughout the Roman Empire at that time, most of the people couldn't read or write. There was no New Testament. So they depended heavily on wandering teachers. Some were very, very good, and some caused a lot of problems. And Paul had a lot to say about them. But whatever else is true, and this is the backcloth of what James is saying, what these itinerant teachers said, and they said it carried great power, for good or for ill. Now, today's culture is entirely visual. And in schools and universities, the idea of someone standing up and haranguing an audience for a period of time is just not recognizable. That's not the way it's done. Sadly, so often in our churches, we haven't moved forward, and we're still working with past thought forms. Now, with that background in mind, which maybe is a bit of a shaker to you, let's look at what James actually said. Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who's never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they're so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. What we say, and particularly in an oral culture as in the days of James, has enormous power for good or for ill. But remember, strip away our modern picture of teachers. Most of us hold a picture of teachers which is far, far distant from what actually goes on in schools, because we remember our own school days. Things have changed. But in the first century, none of these models work. Paul is speaking about people either within the group who are claiming to be able to teach others, or the wandering teachers who move from group to group in a culture that was oral. That's the context. And there's great responsibility and danger in being a teacher, and it's still true today. The word perfect there is nothing to do with ethical perfection. It's a word that means mature, if you like, fully competent. That is true. It is true for teachers in every age and every stage, but it is also true for all of us. Our tongues can do enormous good, or they can create dreadful damage. James is widening it. That's what Jesus said. His followers, his disciples, weren't quite sure how they were to act in a leadership kind of position. The only model they had was the people in Judaism. And speaking about teaching specifically, Jesus says of the Jewish teachers in his day, they loved the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They loved to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi, it just means teacher, by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. There's the equality of value, equality of status before God. There's the danger of being a teacher. It gives power and you can abuse it. An authority figure of any sort, you can abuse the power. The New Testament pictures apostles, prophets, teachers. And these words had specific normal meanings in the language of the day. And the New Testament writers use them consistently, and these three roles are quite clear what is meant at that time, and to suggest that we can change them today just runs contrary to the New Testament teaching. Notice there are no preachers there. The apostle, one, sent. That's the literal meaning of the word. Sent with authority to give the strategic overview and support. Not in a position of authority. It's a role, it's a task, it's something to be done. The prophet spoke the mind of God in a specific situation. That's not preaching. It's not teaching, not apostling. Teachers systematically explain fundamental ideas, usually in the days of the first century, in a sense of dialogue with a small group. And in a sense, in Paul's letters, you can see some of it. He, a great teacher, he's verbally dialoguing with the audience to whom he's writing. Now that's what the background New Testament actually teaches us, and that's where James is focusing. And he's showing the dangers of abusing our position as teachers. In the modern society today, school teachers is one of the most demanding tasks, often misunderstood by those who've never tried it, and probably wouldn't survive if they did. It is extremely demanding intellectually and emotionally. And any discussion with teachers who are in the thick of it, that's very clear. But James is not referring to that. He's referring to the teaching in the context of the first century. And that's what he's saying. In those days you were in a position of power. You probably could read and write. You were in a tiny minority. Gives you power. James is saying use it with caution. He goes on, all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. We humans were made to carry something of the likeness of God, which will be brought to fullness in the end time in Jesus. But if you look at the history of the world, we're capable of so much that's incredibly good. Think of the creative capacity of humans, but we've done so much that's wrong. But we express it in words. It's like water from a spring, and it could do good or evil. Praising God, cursing others. Think of cursing others rather like character assassination. Sadly, I've seen too much of that going on within church groups. As a great politician once said, you can criticize ideas, but you don't criticize people. Wise advice. And James says, isn't that utterly inconsistent? We human beings are terrifically mixed up, but you've got to guard your mouth, guard your tongue, because once the words are out, they have power to do damage or to do good. Be cautious. Now, James has taught a bit about teaching and the spoken word. He moves on to look at what's behind teaching, the attitude of mind. And he comes back to this idea of wisdom. A great teacher teaches with wisdom because they really understand the material they're teaching, but also they understand the learners and respect them. Who is wise and understanding among you, says James, let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbour bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Again, remember the context. Itinerant teachers or local teachers in a culture where most could not read or write. It was an oral culture. The role of the teacher is absolutely vitally important, and it has a leadership edge, as the teaching of Paul reveals. So James moves on, and he talks about the characteristics of those who are teachers in terms of wisdom, wise, and understanding. Yes, we've got to know what we're talking about, but it's an awful lot more than that. Seeing knowledge in the sense of relationship between ideas, the experiences and realities of life, making sense of things, not just pouring facts into people. That's not education, that's not teaching, it never has been. But there's another depth to it, wisdom. Wisdom to grasp the true spiritual nature of what's going on, to see God's ways forward, to understand what God's doing, to interpret and to make sense of it, and to see it in the context of those who are listening. There are very deep ideas here. And many a person towards the end of their life has referred back to some school teacher in the West here today. And they've never lost the memory of the wisdom, the competence, the sensitivity of a teacher who drew the learner and made sense of whatever they were teaching. We need that within our churches and Christian groups today at a new and a deeper level. And James is driving at that. No wonder he's saying don't try and make yourself a teacher. It's a tough job. Now there are dangers here. We're back to that. In the oral culture, the teacher held power, leadership power over a group. And the danger is that they can generate a group who become clones of the teacher. And if the teacher's got it wrong, then all the clones have got it wrong. And that, tragically, is happening in many areas of Christian life, and has happened particularly in the 19th, 20th century throughout the world. You see, power can be abused. And a teacher in the first century had power simply by the nature of what was going on in an oral culture. And Paul suffered at the hands of those who were teaching that which was simply wrong. And many of his letters address that kind of issue. He founded churches, and then teachers got in and caused havoc by misleading the people. James describes it that way: bitter envy and selfish ambition. You can be zealous about something to the point of fanaticism, and then you get caught up with your own rhetoric, your own reputation and power. Oh, there's a terrible danger of the power of being in on a platform with a microphone in your hand. Power over an audience. Towards the end, we'll look at the antidote to that. That has happened down through religion, where demagoguery has got confused and fanaticism has crept in. But the real danger is power can lead to the love of power, and we're more interested in our reputation. James is being very realistic. This is not God's way. It's morally bankrupt. It's a human way of thinking. Totally unspiritual. He's blunt. And indeed it's open to the demonic, the influence of the evil one. And James could see, as Paul could see, has happened, and history shows it happened, and has happened down through the centuries. Communities of God's people are being fractured by teachers. They abuse their authority. They're more interested in establishing their own reputations. And eventually, though they may have started well, there's a danger that everything's framed to enlarge their own sphere of influence. James describes the outcomes: confusions and wrong behavior. And we only have to look at the writings of Paul to see the examples of this worked out in practice. Oh, we have to be so cautious, humble, and examine our motives. Things being done for the benefit of other people, not the enlargement of reputations. James speaks of this wisdom, and he makes the point that it's a gift of God. Nobody, no human being can generate this level of wisdom. God releases it. It's a gift of the Holy Spirit. James describes it as pure. If you like, it's like that. We can't do it. It's from God. It's not trying to generate controversy or trouble. It's peace-loving. A harmony with God, the mind of God, a harmony with others. It considers other people. Empathy is the best word. We're putting our feet in the shoes of the audience, if you like. Submissive, a word that we don't like these days. We're willing to yield. A great Bible teacher, once when he was asked a question, With all his intellectual authority and power, he could have dogmatically stated, and he says, well, this is where my thinking has got to at the moment. How gracious, how gentle. Time showed that his grip on the Bible, understanding of it, was right. Full of mercy and good fruit, all positive, were caring for others, others who haven't got the advantages we have got. Maybe they haven't had the opportunity to study. In the days of James, they probably couldn't read or write. Treating everybody equally. Nothing judgmental. We are not the ones who've arrived and others haven't arrived. We're not the experts who are going to pour all the wisdom into other people. We're sharing together what God has given us with sincerity. No play acting. What a beautiful and magnificent picture. And if you're involved in teaching in the spiritual sense at all, it's worthwhile just stopping and looking at that frame and praying these things into yourself, or getting a group around you to pray them into you. Because that's a wonderful picture of what it's all about. But let's move on. Chapter 4. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive, because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. You adulterous people. That's blunt. Don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? This is worldly way of thinking. Therefore anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you think Scripture says without reason that he jealously longs for the Spirit he has caused to dwell in us, but he gives us more grace? That's why Scripture says God opposes the proud but shows favour to the humble. You'll find that in Proverbs. Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning, your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord. He will lift you up. Brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbour? Now this is all in the context of teaching, but it's got a wider context as well, because it can apply to all of our lives as communities of God's people. That's true. It was true in the days of the first century, and it's been true down through the history of Christianity, sadly. And it can do damage, create confusion. That is certainly possible. And tragically, that's what history shows has happened. No wonder James says, don't want to be a teacher. The dangerous business. But it's not just true of teachers, it's true of us all. In our Christian groups, we can speak irresponsibly and we can create havoc. I've had the sad experience of watching character assassination going on in Christian groups. And it has grieved my heart to watch the damage done to individuals who have lost their confidence, their security and their purpose because they've been character assassinated by a leader, or indeed by anybody. We've got to guard our tongues. Academic studies have shown that divisions and dissensions in churches largely come from power struggles. Individuals or groups want to gain control and do it their way. Oh, it's hard to stop and say, maybe the way I think it should be isn't right, isn't the best way. Or maybe my way, there are other alternatives which are equally valid. That's a hard idea to get a grip on. That's a tragic picture. The story of people seeking personal gain and power, it's happened in every Christian denomination, every group, every century, every country of the world. And one of the tragedies is the abuse of theology. Started in a big scale in the 19th century. It grew in the 20th and it's still occurring today, where people in academia come up with some outrageous theory, push it around, publish it, get their academic promotion, and then leave other people damaged by the ideas. They move on to success, in a sort of a way. History shows that many of these wonderful ideas had no substance. And it appears in teaching. That's what James says. He uses strong language. You may find that very uncomfortable. These things shouldn't happen in Christian groups. Fights, quarrels, battles, kill. I suspect that means character assassination, where you eventually kill someone's own reputation completely. Coveting. And it all comes back to wrong motives. I want it my way. And again, sadly, I can remember a church meeting on one occasion. Hearing a leader in the church say, we've structured and organized this church the way we like it. We don't want it disturbed by young people. I wasn't in a position to say or do anything. I held no responsibility and no status. But within me my heart sank because I knew that he just declared the death knell on that church. The church today doesn't exist. I want it my way. Stop and think. But James has the answer. God's way. Take a decision now. If you're in any position of leadership, teaching, member of any group, take a decision. Let's look for God's way. And no individual has a monopoly on that. Let's come back to the quotation from Proverbs. You'll find a parallel passage in one of the letters of Peter, where he cites the same verse almost in the same context. I've interpreted it that way. God's grace is there to get us back on track when we make a mess of things, but it starts when we recognize we've messed up. Humble. Recognition we don't have all the answers, we've messed up. And he shows favour. His grace is there. Let's get on our knees before God and recognize we don't have all the neat answers. We don't always do things the way that's God's way. that our ways aren't always right, our teaching isn't always right. And let's turn back to God, put it in His hands. You see, this is what James says. Get our lives in line with God's ways. Don't get pushed around with ways which are basically the ways of the evil one. Get God back to the center of all life. Clean up what we're doing. Clean up what we're thinking. Genuine repentance. A recognition that we haven't got things always right and we want it a better way, God's way. A genuine desire to be different. And recognizing that we can't. And when we do that recognition, God can through us. Now there's an agenda for church life. Our fellowships and our communities. It's a wonderful picture. It's an agenda for those who are involved in leadership. Those who are involved in teaching. At any level within the Christian communities or the training of leaders. James is so practical. Too easy to slander one another. The days of James' teachers were powerful leadership figures. And seeing what Paul suffered, James is writing in that same context. We have no right to condemn anybody. Only God can see the total picture. A challenge to us in our churches and communities today, as it was in the days of the first century. As we draw it to a close, let's just summarize it. The context has been teaching, in the first century sense, in an oral culture which most could not read or write. But much applies in exactly the same way today. And it goes beyond teaching. Our tongues have great power to do wonderfully good or to create havoc. And sadly, that's what's been happening. Theology has been abused in training colleges and educational establishments. Teaching has been abused to manipulate people into given thought forms and ways of doing things. And much of it is by people who are seeking personal gain and power. And James says, don't try to be a teacher. That's the outcome. And you can see it in the divisions and splits in our society of churches today throughout the world. And that's the origin. James could see it. Research confirms it looking backwards. Generates confusion. Generates wrong behavior. And there's the answer. Recognize we've got things a bit wrong, a big bit wrong. We don't have all the answers. Turn back to God.